I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War is called cold because it supposedly never heated up into actual armed conflict, which means, that it wasn't a war. Mr. Green, but if the war on Christmas is a war and the war on drugs is a war... You're not going to hear me say this often in your life, me for the past, but that was a good point. At least the Cold War was not an attempt to make war on a noun, which almost never works because nouns are so resilient. And to be fair, the Cold War did involve quite a lot of actual war, from Korea to Afghanistan, as the world's two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, sought ideological and strategic influence throughout the world. So perhaps it's best to think of the Cold War as an era, lasting roughly from 1945 to 1990. Discussions of the Cold War tend to center on international and political history, and those are very important, which is why we've talked about them in the past. This, however, is United States history, so let us heroically gaze, as Americans so often do, at our own navel. Stan, why did you turn the globe to the green parts of not America? I mean, I guess to be fair, we were a little bit obsessed with this guy. So the Cold War gave us great spy novels, independence movements, and arms race cool movies like Dr. Strangelove and War Games, one of the most evil mustaches in history. But it also gave us a growing awareness that the greatest existential threat to human beings is ourselves. It changed the way we imagine the world and humanity's role in it. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, William Faulkner famously said, "Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up?" So today we're going to look at how that came to be the dominant question of human existence and whether we can ever get past it.
So welcome to one of my favorite things to teach about, which is the Cold War. The Cold War lasted, as John Green just suggested, from about 1945 to, depending upon who you ask, either 1989 or 1990 or 1991. So some people put it at the fall of the Soviet Union. Anyway, so 45 years of Cold War conflict. So as you guys know, at the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union are actually allies, but that will quickly change. And one of the things that I think had an impact upon the relationship of the two countries was the political leaders that existed at the time. So when we last talked about the Yalta Conference, there was a trio of men, Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. And even though the three of them didn't all three like each other, FDR and Winston Churchill happened to have a very close bond, but Joseph Stalin was kind of begrudgingly respectful. He knew that the two elicited an extreme amount of power. However, when Franklin D. Roosevelt died and Harry Truman replaced him, Harry Truman was not as confident and charismatic as Franklin D. Roosevelt, and immediately Joseph Stalin understood that he had power. And he didn't begrudgingly respect Harry Truman, and in fact, I think it empowered Stalin to know that all of a sudden the United States was led by somebody he didn't have as much respect for. And I think that's going to affect things as we move forward. Now, of course, there's all kinds of other factors that are probably even more important, but I think the relationship of people matters as well. So today we're going to look at the origins of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union are going to emerge as the two superpowers, but they have very different political and economic systems, which is one of the things that's going to set them at odds with one another. So you guys will remember that at the end of World War I, the League of Nations was created, but the United States, even though it had been kind of an architect of the League of Nations, decided to be a holdout. And as a result, the organization that was meant to prevent another war was weakened, and it did not effectively keep another war from happening. So at the end of World War II, when the United Nations was proposed, the United States chose to get involved very heavily. In fact, it was originally called something called the Atlantic Charter. It was discussed on a ship in the midst of the Atlantic Ocean, which is where the name came from. And even before the war was over, Eleanor Roosevelt was sent as the very first delegate to the United Nations to represent the United States. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how the United Nations works and some of the really important people that play roles today that help us to maintain peace. So on the bottom left hand of your screen, you have Eleanor Roosevelt, who was kind of the eyes and ears of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And in April of 1945, she went to San Francisco and attended the very first meeting of the fledgling United Nations. And she helped to draft something called the Declaration of Human Rights, which is kind of the foundational document of the United Nations. This is a guy named George Kennan. George Kennan was an expert on the Soviet Union and helped us to develop our foreign policy that can lead us into the Cold War because of what he believed about the Soviet Union and what the president chose to believe that he said. Our foreign policy was dictated in part by George Kennan. And the two men on the right are Ban Ki-moon, who just recently left the Secretary General's position at the United Nations and was replaced. By the way, Ban Ki-moon is from South Korea, or was from South Korea. And really intelligent man. I enjoyed hearing him speak on a couple of movies that I've watched. And he was replaced recently by this guy, Antonio Guterres. And he is presently the Secretary General of the United Nations, one of the most influential people in the world. Away we go. Former allies clash. So the United States and the Soviet Union had really different ambitions for the future. The political differences created a climate of really icy tension that plunged the two countries into a really bitter rivalry. Under Soviet communism, the state controlled all the property and economic activity, while in the capitalistic American system, private citizens controlled almost all the economic activity. In the American system, voting by the people elected a president and a Congress from competing political parties. And in the Soviet Union, the Communist Party established a totalitarian government with no opposing parties. The United States was furious that Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had been an ally of Hitler for a short time. Stalin had supported the Allies only after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and in some ways the Americans and Soviets became more suspicious of each other during the war. Stalin resented the Western Allies' delay in attacking Germany in Europe. Such an attack, he thought, would have drawn part of the German army away from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union, as you know, suffered immensely at the hands of the Germans. Relations worsened after Stalin learned the United States had kept the atomic bomb a secret from them, even though they were allies. In spite of these problems, though, hopes for world peace were really high at the end of the war. The most visible symbol of these hopes was the United Nations, or the UN. On April 25th of 1945, 50 different nations met in San Francisco to establish this new peacekeeping body, and after 2 months of debate, on June 26th of 1945, the delegates signed the charter establishing the United Nations. Ironically, even though the UN was intended to promote peace, it soon became an arena in which the two superpowers competed. Both the US and the Soviet Union used the UN as a forum to spread their influence over others. So how does this United Nations work anyway? It's kind of interesting. So the General Assembly is the body of the United Nations where all member nations sit. Almost every nation in the world belongs to the United Nations today, and they all sit on the General Assembly. It's kind of cool because at the General Assembly, when people are talking, there are earbuds translating into every native tongue to the representatives, and so as one person is speaking, it's being translated into hundreds of different languages. There are about 196, 197 different member nations in the United Nations today. Now, here's where the interesting thing happens, and you really have to pay attention here. One of the most powerful bodies of the United Nations is called the Security Council. The Security Council is made up of 15 member nations. 5 of those nations are permanent spots, meaning they never change. At the end of World War II, the United States helped to establish the United Nations, and so it also gave kind of this kind of power to its friends. So at the end of World War II, the Security Council's 5 permanent seats were made up of the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. The thing about the permanent seats is they have to agree. Any one of the permanent seats can veto any action in the Security Council, and it will be null and void. In addition to the 5 permanent seats that never rotate off, there are also 10 rotating memberships that last for 2 years, I believe. Hang on just a second and I'll show you the list today. So these are some of the numbers for you. So depending on how you define country, there are roughly 196 countries in the world, and of the 196, almost all belong to the United Nations. There are a couple of places that just get observer status, like Vatican City where the Pope lives, and Palestine, because it's not officially recognized by some other countries as an entity. Kosovo and Taiwan don't sit, in part because Kosovo hasn't been recognized yet, and China views Taiwan as part of China, even though the United States views Taiwan as a separate entity. So anyway, there are a couple of those kinds of situations, but most member nations, most countries belong. These are the rotating and permanent Security Council seats. So you can see at the top, China, France, now we call it the Russian Federation. At the time it was called the Soviet Union. Now it's called the United Kingdom. Then it was called Great Britain and the United States. So these are the permanent. And then here are the rotating members. So Germany came on board, is leaving in 2020. You can see that they serve for 2 years term. So Vietnam just rolled on and won't roll off until 2021. Okay, so there's General Assembly made up of all nations. There's a Security Council where a lot of the bread and butter gets decided. And there are 15 total nations represented there, 5 that never rotate off, 10 that do rotate off in 2-year cycles. There's a General Secretary, and it used to be Ban Ki-moon and has just been replaced by Antonio Guterres. These are the permanent members of the Security Council and the number of times that they've used their veto and the years in which they did it. So you can see that in the beginning of this Cold War cycle, the Soviet Union used a veto power 106 times. Okay, here's the old crew, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, and then Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. This picture I love. I think this picture is funny because this is Clement Attlee on the left. Winston Churchill gets replaced by a guy named Clement Attlee, and I just want you to go look back at the body language. I mean, if you think Stalin didn't respect Truman because FDR was more powerful, look at Winston Churchill, the studly guy that he is, always packing around that cigar. And now he's been replaced by Clement Attlee. Oh my goodness, that body language says, I'm afraid I might wet myself. Okay. Stalin's refusal to allow free elections in Poland convinced Truman that the United States and the Soviet Union's aims were just deeply at odds. Truman's test as a diplomat came in July of 1945 when the Big Three, U.S., Great Britain, and Soviet Union, met at a final wartime conference in Potsdam near Berlin. The countries that participated were the same ones that had been present at Yalta. Stalin still represented the Soviet Union, but Clement Attlee had replaced Churchill as Britain's representative mid-conference. At Yalta, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that he would allow free elections, but, of course, he went back on that. Truman's goal in demanding free elections was to spread democracy to nations that had been under Nazi rule. He also wanted to create a new world order in which all nations had the right to self-determination. At the Yalta Conference, the Soviets had wanted to take reparations from Germany to help repay for Soviet wartime losses. Now, at Potsdam, Truman objected to that, and after really hard bargaining, it agreed that the Soviets, the British, the Americans, and French would take reparations mainly from their own occupation zones within Germany. They were deeply at odds about what to do with Western Europe.